Greetings, Jeepers. So today we're going to install this steering box into the frame of this 2A, 1947 2A. And it looks to be a pretty simple process. You got 3 bolts. They are 3-inch long, 7/16 fine thread. You'll need a washer, you'll need a lock washer, and a bolt for a nut for these bolts.
One very important step is make sure you install your steering column tube bracket here, because this bracket will not get through the firewall on your Jeep. So just slide it all the way on. Like that. And now you can install your steering box into your Jeep.
And if you can see from the inside of the tub, just feed those bolts in through the pre-drilled holes with the washer on the outside of the frame.
With your raw steering box now angled just straight on to the hole that is through the firewall of your Jeep. And when there's no engine, this is how you do it, but if you have an engine, it's a different story. So we would just push our worm gear and steering box just straight through the firewall, and then we'll go up at an angle. And we'll get close to those 3 bolts, and now we will thread those bolts through the steering box. So now we will get those 3 bolts lined up, and we'll just push them through the steering box right to the frame, and that is all 3 of them. And now we will put a lock washer and a nut on all 3 bolts. We can't forget to install our exhaust pipe heat shield that will go underneath our brake master cylinder, and it just attaches to the one bolt that holds on your master cylinder and the bottom bolt on your Ross steering box. Finally, tighten up your heat shield. Just hand tight onto your tie bar on your master cylinder. Make sure you tighten all the bolts on your master cylinder if it's loosened, because it's easier to do now before the engine gets installed. Once you get your bolts started here with your nuts and lock washers, we want to make sure we put our steering column tube through the firewall so we can get our worm gear centered in this hole. Before we torque the bolts on our steering box, we want to make sure we have our steering box in the right orientation. So we have to make sure that we tighten up our steering column onto the dashboard so we get this angle of the steering box in the correct direction, because once you tighten these bolts, you won't be able to move your steering box in either direction. We are now facing the dashboard side on the driver's side where the steering wheel will be located. And we have to make sure we have our steering column tube pressed against our bracket that will hold up our steering wheel here, and we'll just use a clamp and a piece of rubber and make sure this is properly set. This right here is your steering column tube rubber, and this will go over your steering column tube here, be placed into this bracket with this little groove will seat on both sides of your bracket. Then we'll push up our column tube here, and you can see how the steering box actually moves. We want to make sure we get this set right before we tighten those bolts up. With your other part of your bracket that will hold up your steering column tube, we will put it on to the other side with the rubber wrapping around your tube, and then we'll just push it up firmly against the top here, and we'll just tighten these bolts down to secure it. And now we'll just use these 2 bolts with your lock washer and your nut, and we'll just tighten them up, and this will be firmly set. You may need to trim your rubber molding to fit your steering column tube, as these come pretty universal, can be used really on any Jeep. Lastly, we need to install our upper steering column bearing into our steering column tube, so we center our worm gear in the steering column tube here, because we need to make sure everything is lined up before we tighten the bolts and torque the bolts on our steering box. To install our upper steering column bearing, we will just slide it onto our worm gear and just press it onto the steering column tube, and that will seat it all the way in. Now it's time to torque our raw steering box to the frame. We're going to torque it to 50 foot-pounds, and we'll just go in a circle to torque all of the nuts. Finally, install your lower steering column clamp with a 5/16 2-inch long bolt, fine thread with your nut and lock washer, and that will hold your steering column tube in place. Make sure to subscribe to Let's Build a Willys Jeep so you can get all your videos related to how to get your steering box properly installed, and the linkage, and how to get your tires turning when you actually turn the steering wheel, and that will be in other videos.